Hello and welcome to this week's Bible study preview. Doing something different this week. For most of the summer we've been looking at our Old Testament lesson assigned for worship. Not going to do that this week. Instead, I picked out 3 Old Testament lessons that aren't the most well-known lessons. So hopefully it'll give you a chance to learn something new with this study. 3 occasions in which God's people were facing a challenging situation as a nation, and 3 leaders, Moses, King Hezekiah, and a man named Nehemiah, pray to God and ask him to do certain powerful, wonderful things on behalf of the nation. A lot to learn for us today as we think about our country and challenges that stand before us and God's promises to us. So like we did last week, we're going to start with a short video clip. So I'll let you watch that right now. Alright, the video clip that you had there was about an artist who worked with a pretty interesting medium, a balancing artist. So the activity we'll go through together in our Zoom meetings. After watching the video, describe what you think goes into the artist's work. So this is maybe a confusing video to tie to our lesson today. Let's see if you can figure out why I would have chosen that sort of artist doing what he did to talk about our relationship with God as a country. Alright, we're just going to give you a quick overview of the 3 lessons. The first lesson comes from Exodus 33. The situation there, Israel has been brought out of Egypt after over 400 years of slavery. God brought them out of the country through the 10 plagues. Finally, the Egyptians and Pharaoh just said, "Get out of here. We don't want you here anymore." Egyptians changed their mind. They pursue the Israelites to the Red Sea. God parts the Red Sea. Millions of Israelites walk across. God, puts the Red Sea back together. All those enemies of Israel, this very powerful army with all their chariots, are just gone in a moment. God is powerful. God gathers the Israelites at Mount Sinai. God comes down to them in smoke, thunder, and fire, and they're terrified of God. God gives them the 10 Commandments. They say, "Of course, whatever you say to do, we will do it." Spoiler alert, they will not do that. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak. In fact, before the proverbial ink was even dry on this covenant, they had really broken it by asking Aaron to form a golden calf for them and bowing down to this calf and saying that somehow this calf had a role in rescuing them from Egypt. So a lot of up and down things to this point when we get to Exodus 33. Essentially, Moses comes to God, and here you see him, depiction of him perhaps receiving the 10 Commandments. He basically says, God, where we go from here, it's up to you. And he asks God to make it clear that his presence will go with them. Moses knows that they're on their way to the promised land. And Moses realizes he is a sinful human being with lots of flaws. He recognizes he's being called to lead a nation that is full of flawed people. So basically tells God, if you are not going to go with us, don't send us at all, because we are nothing without you. And it's this great prayer in which Moses just lays himself bare before God. Says, I need you. As a country, we need you. You have to bless us. And God says, of course I'll go with you. And the section ends with God actually showing Moses his a portion of his glory. After God promises that his presence will go with them, Moses almost seems like he's sort of, okay, you're gonna go with us? That's great. Can you allow me to see you? And God says, nah, I can't let you see me. You're sinful. I'm holy. You would die. But he allows Moses to see a portion of his glory. Really allows him to see his back. So a very interesting scene to discuss there. That's lesson 1. Second lesson comes from 2 Kings, chapter 19. And the man in charge is a man named Hezekiah. Out of a long list of bad kings in Judah and Israel, Hezekiah is one of the good ones. He's ruling around 700 BC. His father was a terrible king in the sense that he promoted false worship, idolatry, and things like that. Hezekiah takes over for him and smashes a lot of those idols and high places where they would worship gods like Baal and Asherah. He takes a lot of those down. The nation of Assyria and their leader Sennacherib are an incredibly powerful force at this time. So they're just sort of dominating the countries around Israel. They've taken the northern kingdom already, and so they come to Jerusalem. They set up shop about 20 miles away, and essentially put Jerusalem under siege and say, you might as well give up, because we've dominated all the countries around you. We're going to do the same to you. In a moment of weakness, Hezekiah pays them a ransom, and unfortunately, this is a sad thing. He takes many of the silver utensils from the temple, strips some of the precious metals, including gold, from the temple doorways, and gives the money to Sennacherib and his associates, and essentially says, just take this money and leave us alone. Well, it goes poorly, very poorly. Sennacherib did not keep his word after receiving the payment, and he sends his advisors to go out and meet some of Hezekiah's advisors. And Sennacherib's advisors basically tell the Israelite delegation, and within earshot of many people in Jerusalem, this is going to go very poorly for you. If you don't surrender, things are going to be awful. We have destroyed all sorts of other people, and they all had their own gods, and we've taken down one of them after the other. So if you're smart, you won't listen to Hezekiah. You'll listen to us, and you'll surrender. You'll give up the city. Because your king doesn't know what he's talking about. He thinks that the Egyptians are going to come rescue him. Guess what? We are stronger than the Egyptians. And also, your king just made a huge mistake. What do gods want? They want altars. And your king just took down a bunch of altars. So you're in a terrible spot. Now, nobody in the southern kingdom responded because Hezekiah told them, don't respond to this at all. But the things that Sennacherib's advisors said about Israel and said about God were just terrible. So Hezekiah puts on sackcloth and ashes. He does a great thing. He takes the letter that he'd received from Sennacherib's delegation, and he goes to the temple, and he lays the letter out, and he just, like Moses before him, lays himself open before God and just says, we need you. We are in big trouble. There is this enemy nation that you know very well. They are much more powerful than we are. We've made tons of mistakes. We need you to show your power right now. And God answers in a big way. We'll talk about that in our Zoom class. So that's the second lesson. A lot of good stuff there to talk about so far. Third one is from Nehemiah 1. This takes place about 100 years after Daniel's life. Think about the different things we talked about in the Daniel study in late December, early January. So this is about 100 years after that. So exiles had already made 2 big returns to their homeland around Jerusalem. So 536 BC, Cyrus, the leader of Persia, had sent some of them back. 458 BC, another big group went back. Nehemiah is this guy that's a very trusted advisor to Artaxerxes. He's the cupbearer, which means that he's responsible for whatever Artaxerxes drinks, which back in those times there was constant fear that someone might try to poison you. So Nehemiah is really a go-to guy and a higher up in the Persian government, even though he's a Jew, an Israelite. So Nehemiah gets word that things are just not going well back in Jerusalem, and he was under the impression that they were. This in 12 years before this, that second group had gone back, and he thought he hadn't heard much, so things must be going well. They must have rebuilt the walls. They must be rebuilding the temple, and he finds out that is not the case. That the temple is nothing like it was before. They have not done a ton of work in the temple. They have not finished the walls, and so Nehemiah does what Moses did, what Hezekiah did before him. He prays to God on behalf of his nation. And he confesses that we've made some huge errors as a nation. It's why we were in Babylon in the first place. It's why things aren't going well now. We always do this. We turn away from you, God. We turn to false idols, and we completely understand why you have allowed us to be in this position. But please remember us. Remember the covenant you made to Moses, you made to Israel. Remember the promises you made. We are your humble servants, and we ask that you would bless us now. And Nehemiah ends up going back as part of a third group going back in exile to rebuild the walls and rebuild the temple. So pick these three sort of, not totally obscure, but I don't know that you've spent a lot of time studying any of those three accounts, just because they're good reminders for us in terms of our relation to our country. Our country has lots of problems. There's no denying that. Our country also has lots of blessings, lots of freedom, specifically the freedom to worship like we do. So the Vicar's sermon text is 1 Timothy 2. I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. 3 lessons we'll talk about in our Zoom study. 3 godly men who all ask for God's blessing upon their country, his protection, his power, his love. And that is so appropriate for us to ask the same thing for our country today, that we have a government that allows us to keep getting the gospel out there and to do that peacefully. All right, I look forward to studying with you. Take care.